All right, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. And welcome back to our podcast. With election day just around the corner, we're diving deep into an increasingly divided political landscape among Muslim American voters. Today's topic, Abandon Harris, explores what's happening in our communities as key issues, like the Gaza crisis, has pushed some Muslims away from traditional political affiliations. We'll be discussing fresh polling data, recent endorsements, and what these trends mean for our future in the US and for Muslims abroad. Today, joining us is Ustadh Mobeen Vaid, a writer and thinker deeply engaged with these critical topics. Mobeen, thank you for joining us.
Jazakallah khair for having me.
So let's start with a quick look at the most recent polling data. According to a CARE poll that was just conducted, Jill Stein and Kamala Harris are both in a statistical dead heat among Muslim voters. I believe they're polling at about 42% each, with Trump trailing but still holding on to around 10% support. The poll indicates that the U.S. support for Gaza has had a profound impact on voter preferences, with many Muslims citing it as their top concern. In fact, recently, Somali leaders in Minnesota publicly endorsed Trump. They held a press conference and they joined other Muslim voices like the mayors of Hamtramck and also the religious leaders in Dearborn. This shift away from the Democratic ticket is unprecedented and has raised some important questions about loyalty, values, and strategic voting in the community. So, Mubin, let's dive into the key reasons for this political shift. I want to begin by talking about the piece in the Middle East Eye from Azad Isa, and that gives us a closer look at the grassroots Muslim American organizers for Kamala Harris. They're finding it increasingly hard to gain support among Muslim voters, many of whom are frustrated with the Democratic Party's stance on Gaza. So, in your opinion, do you think the talking points offered by the Harris campaign, such as, for example, her hosting the Eid al-Adha celebration, do you think that resonates at all with Muslim voters? Is there any level at all? Personally, and again, this is just my personal take, I don't think it does. I think it's very token. What are your thoughts on it?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Well, of course it's token. They're grasping at straws. That is so profoundly unlikable and has been one of the key faces behind the genocide, the people of Gaza. It's important to keep in mind that we're having this podcast today. And just a few hours ago, it was reported that the 3 functional hospitals, and the term functional here being used very loosely, but the 3 remaining functional hospitals in North Gaza were under siege by IDF forces. And so we're talking about something that remains ongoing, and that at every step of the way, both her and the rest of that administration has provided cover for, run interference for, aggressively denied and attacked Muslims and pro-Palestinian organizations from questioning. And if you're part of the Muslims for Harris camp, in some ways, you have to sidestep that issue, you have to explain it away, or you simply have to insist that Donald Trump would have been and remains a far graver threat than Kamala Harris is. The challenge I have with a lot of people that are active in these spaces is not that they support a particular candidate. I think people are always going to arrive at different political conclusions and judgments. People are entitled to make different judgments. I don't think everybody has to have same opinions on every political issue. Nevertheless, I think the issue that we have in this country, and certainly within our community, is when politics becomes a sort of ideology. And for a lot of people, they're pre-committed to a political candidate, irrespective of what they do. And there's virtually nothing they can do or say to make them lose their support. And this is a
What do
question.
you mean when you say it becomes an ideology? Do you mean it becomes almost a religious dogma in and of itself?
People actually will compromise much more quickly when it comes to their religious beliefs than they will with their political beliefs. And so there are different polls and statistics that have, and studies that have focused on this, especially over the last few years. The decline in marriages between people of differing politics and dating between people of different politics. The way in which people's political commitments shift almost seamlessly with the parties themselves, and how those political commitments transcend their professed beliefs. And so if you look at a liberal Christian, liberal Jew, liberal Muslim, liberal atheist, they all believe the same thing. And it just so happens that Coincidentally, quote unquote, they all have the same views on abortion, gun control, on taxation, on healthcare and the public option. And you'd say, how can people who come from such divergent backgrounds think the exact same thing, not on a solitary issue, which you might say, okay, reasonable people. It's not unreasonable to think that a plurality of people from different faiths and backgrounds will come to or arrive at the same conclusion on one issue. But 10, 15, 20 issues that comprise an entire platform, they're basically in lockstep on all of those, in spite of the fact that they're coming at these issues from such a widely different background. And what it suggests is that their political identities are actually far more substantive insofar as it determines how they should live, how they think about issues, what their actual beliefs are, than their religions, which, or their beliefs about God and the nature of life and the afterlife. These are all things that end up being secondary. And so that's a real challenge. And that's why I think one of the questions that people have attempted to press a lot of these sort of left wing ideologues, especially given the fact that this genocide has been carried out by the Biden Harris administration, has been, what is your red line? Is there anything these people could do that would cause you to reconsider your vote?
Yeah,
Yes.
it seems like even in the article, there was an attempt by some of those people, some of the not Aban Harris, some of the Muslims for Harris group, to try to bring up some of those legitimate concerns, and I think maybe some of them were concerned with those red lines that you brought up, but it seems like even in the article, they discuss the leaders within that WhatsApp group shut down the discussion.
They have to try to cultivate conformity. They recognize that certain issues are really difficult issues to discuss and persuade people about because there may not be a good answer to those questions. And if your candidate has been complicit and guilty of genocide, that's not an easy political issue just to set aside. The typical political tack that most people use in electoral politics in the West is to try to deflect by looking at the faults of the opposing candidate. In this case, as bad as Trump has been, he didn't carry out a genocide. He just didn't. He doesn't have a genocide on his track record.
Which,
By
by the way, some people tried to say he did commit a genocide. I believe it was Mehdi Hassan in one of his monologues that he tried to claim that the what happened with Yemen with the wars, the weapons that were given to Saudi and then Saudi using those in Yemen were in fact a genocide of some type. But I don't think, as you said, Trump has not
no.
really been guilty of such.
So I authored an article. It's called "Lies, Damned Lies, and Mehdi Hassan's Facts." And it actually that's what there's a section on it specifically on Yemen. And although there's a lot of tragedy in Yemen, certainly many
Yeah,
atrocities
there's no
there,
apologizing for
no,
what's
no
going on at
question
all.
about it, requires a radical redefining of the term genocide itself. There's a lot of atrocities, human rights violations, plenty of criticism to go around. It's just not a genocide. There have been some academic cases that have been made to try to categorize it, but all of those cases have openly stated that the only academic case that could be made would require totally redefining what genocide is and incorporating a lot of things that people don't traditionally think about, including generational mental health effects and things like that. And we're not talking about a explicit ethnic cleansing project carried out by an oppressor against an oppressed population with indiscriminate and mass slaughter going on month after month, hundreds of thousands of people, over 10% of Gaza's population, rendering over half, in fact, rendering the entire Gaza completely and totally uninhabitable. Over half of Gaza is now completely destroyed and flattened. Over 45 million tons of rubble that has integrated into that rubble the remains, dead bodies of individuals, men, women, and children, unexploded munitions, and military weapons. They say there are some estimates today that just cleaning the rubble alone will take nearly 15 to 20 years. And so when you look at the conflict in Yemen, there actually were multiple sides engaged in it. And the UN's reporting on it, especially its human rights arm, showed that there were human rights violations by all sides. And this is something that is a challenge to bring up because the Houthis are not innocent actors. Although they've taken many courageous stances on the topic of Palestine and they've stuck their
Yes.
neck out there in incredible ways in defense of Palestine, they were nevertheless guilty of many crimes in Yemen in the way in which they acquired power and orchestrated a coup, militarily conquered a lot of regions in Yemen. So again, there were many sides to it, but to describe it as a genocide, deliberate deceit, is an attempt to try to conflate or equate the type of problems within the presidency of Donald Trump and what we've seen over the last year under the Biden Harris administration. And I consider that a really dishonest, perhaps his most dishonest argument that he made in that little quip monologue that he put together. Because, and this is something that I have an issue with is I don't, as I've said before, I don't really mind who people support politically. But when their political support entails, as it often does, an attenuation of the genocide, a playing down of it, spinning it as something that's not that big, using the term genocide, but more as a activist canard and not something that has real substance to it and reflects on the reality of what we're talking about. When that begins to happen, I consider it reprehensible.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned that because in the very same article that we're discussing right now, I just want to read a quote from it regarding how the members of that group discussed the pro Palestinian protesters calling this particular war right now a genocide. And there was one quote in there where one of the participants said the following: "The word genocide should never have been used from the beginning." And I think that this person is, they have your perspective, but for what's happening right now in Gaza, it should never been used from the beginning. And I think its use by the pro Palestinian movement for the last year was not only wrong, but also responsible for fueling the continuation of the war and the suffering by diluting and even, and again, this is a misspelling, contamination of the message. Therefore, I think Harris is 100% wise for not using that term. One participant in the group wrote, and then Middle East Eye reports that this comment has been, it's this comment from October 27th remains in the group. What are your thoughts on that?
If the Muslims for Harris movement is going to publicly embrace Muslim Zionism, I would say that's at least an honest position to take insofar as they're being transparent about where they are on the issue.
I
What
just
I
wonder though how it is that they can take such a position when it's not just the protesters. The ICJ had 15 of 17 judges come forward and say, yeah, Israel is plausibly committing a genocide. And there are numerous human rights organizations and relief organizations that are saying, yeah, this is a genocide. This is out
Yeah,
of
I mean,
control. And
the repeating talking points that have been made by groups like the ADL and the IDF, right?
Hmm,
If those are the type of talking points they want to stand behind, that's up to them. Now, that's a single participant in a WhatsApp group. I don't know if that's reflective of popular opinion there
of course.
within the movement itself. So I think we should be clear about that, at least based on what you read. Nevertheless, if that is a broadly held sentiment, then it's better for people to know that rather than proceeding under the illusion that we are all reading from the same sheet of music. And in doing so, we're arriving at the conclusion that Harris is a better candidate. In
I would
some
hope
way,
in a WhatsApp group that at the very least they come forward, somebody comes forward and disagrees and says, look, maybe we're not in a good place politically, but what you're saying is
yeah,
completely untrue.
I mean,
This is a
absolutely,
genocide.
that sentiment should be disqualifying.
Yeah.
It should be disqualifying. And maybe it is an indication that their movement is much weaker than we think, such that they really don't have the luxury of kicking people out right now, even people who have openly Zionist sympathies, right? Or commitments. Like they're just willing to hold anybody up as part of the movement because they just don't have too many people right now.
Hmm.
That may be it. I don't know. Politics makes for stranger bedfellows. At this time of the year, people get very desperate. They
Yes.
lose all of their morals. They lose all of their values. And this reflects on something I wrote in an article recently, which was actually the same at Hassan piece, which is that again, I how people vote, separate question. How people arrive at their vote, like what drives them, what motivates them when it comes to their beliefs and values, when it comes to what they're hoping to accomplish, when it comes to what they're willing to say, those are all incredibly consequential. They aren't harmless things. As for instance, one of the things that's very common in politics is lying about candidates and lying about your opponent to make them seem like they said something they didn't, misrepresenting their track record, or in some other way distorting the facts. Now, for us as Muslims, even if we're committed to a candidate, we should be people who are committed to the truth as well, because the truth supersedes our love for any candidate. And if someone is distorting or misrepresenting facts against someone that we revile and hate, we should actually correct the record It's a responsibility to do simply because accuracy and precision should be something that we're known for. We should be people of integrity, irrespective of the context and we're in. And even if accuracy and precision and honesty results in us being impugned in some way, if it bears negative consequences on us, we stand for justice, even if it's against ourselves, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do in the Quran. And so I think when we see movements or groups that rise up, that it's a lack of integrity, I think it's to their own detriment. And I imagine that people in the group itself were likely, I'm sure many people probably viewed a message like that and felt minimally uncomfortable, and others hopefully made them reconsider whether or not this is the right movement they want to be a part of. Even if I'm in favor of Harris, is this the type of movement that I want to be in the middle of to support Harris? Or is there something better that I can contrive between now and November 5th, right? 2 days from now? There's
Yeah.
something better that I can construct that can provide a more ethical platform for advocating for Harris than this rot.
And I think that was one of their frustrations as I was reading the article. And from what I've seen from commentators who also oppose Harris, the one thing that they've been looking for is how are you different from Joe Biden? What will you promise Muslims? What will you promise the Arab community in Dearborn or Hamtramck or anywhere in Michigan or other related voters? What will you promise them that you'll do differently? And it seems that the only thing she's really done is create targeted ads that splice quotes that seem to support and say Gaza, what's going on there is bad in one region, and then in another region with more Jewish support saying that, yeah, what happened in Israel was bad and we will always support Israel. We will always provide weapons and allow them to defend themselves. And I think she went on to also repeat some of those debunked lies about rape and beheadings and so forth. But we're not really seeing, my point is that we're not really seeing from her anything different. Don't really have anything to hold on to come back and say, yeah, Harris is better than Trump because Trump is, from what we can see, he's going out of his way to meet people. And actually, let's talk about that next now. I wanted to talk about this interview that
Well,
Mehdi.
before we get there, just real quick, I'll say
Sure.
I don't know that I can remember a Democratic presidential candidate in recent memory that has thumbed his or her nose at the Muslim community quite like Harris has done everything she can over the last couple of weeks to court minorities. She's gone to Puerto Rican restaurants, she's gone to black barbershops, she's gone to black churches. She's going from one minority group sort of location and photo op to the next. She's meeting with them aggressively. Her husband, who's Jewish, is meeting with Jewish groups to court them. She
Yep.
is doing a lot to target minority voters, and she's doing that for everybody except for Muslims.
Yeah. At her rally at the DNC, they didn't allow any Muslim, Palestinian, Arab speakers to speak
Not only
as they
that,
normally do.
we're not seeing any photo ops with Muslims. We're not seeing her visit any mosques or Muslim establishments. Obama and others, you'd see them, at least in photo ops, with hijabis next to them and things like that.
Yep.
You don't even see something like that out of Harris. In some ways, she's very deliberate in distancing herself from Muslims. I think part of it has been the opposition that she's received from pro Palestine protesters, and perhaps that's made her a bit allergic to the community overall. But nevertheless, it's very clear that she's basically rejecting Muslims as a constituency that she has to appeal to or try to persuade to vote to her. She just seems to not care a whole lot.
She doesn't really have anything to offer in terms of responding to why they should vote for her. If she says, vote for me because I'm better than Trump, they're just going to come back and say, but you're committing a genocide with Joe Biden. I'm just reminded now of how horribly Bill Clinton tried to address this issue by lecturing to Muslims. The people who were killed in the kibbutz were how much they loved the Palestinian people and wanted a two-state solution, and then they were killed. And so now we shouldn't be asking how many people the IDF and Israel and the Zionists are going to kill because there's a different equation for how we process this when it's them taking action against the Palestinians. Now we just have to accept that they're all human shields, and whatever it takes to go after them and take out Hamas, we have to just accept. And I
It's
don't
even
feel
worse
like
than that.
Harris will have a much different answer
Well,
given.
it was even worse than that. He drew on biblical and Old Testament teachings to say they were there first.
Yes.
Or they have a greater claim to the land than you Arabs, right? And yeah, it was about as racist a diatribe as you could possibly hear. from a candidate, just horribly bigoted.
Yeah.
And no one it's interesting to me because it's not uncommon for people to get outraged, especially in these days. You're having a all out blitz when it comes to campaign programs and events, right? And they're constantly going. Everybody has surrogates that are deployed on the ground. And surrogates are liable to say things that are objectionable because in a campaign event, you'll have multiple speakers. Many of them make off color remarks, right? And so in the New York event, you had that insult comedian at the Trump rally, made a number of offensive remarks, but that's sort of his shtick. And then you also had Giuliani made a number of offensive remarks on the topic of Palestine, Israel, which again should definitely be concerning. But what I was surprised by was I shouldn't be surprised. I should say that one of the things I noticed was that many Harris supporters highlighted the Giuliani remarks and completely ignored the Bill Clinton ones. And whatever you think of the two candidates, Bill Clinton, as a political figure on the campaign trail, is far more consequential than Giuliani. Giuliani is just like a dispensable New York character, if you will. Bill
Yeah.
Clinton is someone who carries a lot of weight and continues to carry a lot of authority within the DNC and the Democratic Party overall. The idea that his sentiments would not receive a fraction of Giuliani's scrutiny is crazy to me. It really is crazy to me. The way that they overlook these really open and obvious flaws in that situation, genocidal rhetoric from a man that's just because he's on their sort of quote unquote team. And that's the challenge with political partisanship is that it turns people into such immoral and unethical figures. They're people who just lose all of their moral bearings at the altar of partisan politics, which I don't consider to be something that anyone should have much respect for.
I think if we were to try to see them in good faith, it would probably be that they see that these are gaffes, mistakes, and that even if those remarks are indeed racist, there is a greater good that they're serving. And they're holding out a lot of hope that there's that greater good at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I think a gaffe is a misspoken word. This was an entire multi-minute
Oh, of course.
diatribe.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
This was clearly deliberate. You have to think people like Bill Clinton don't speak extemporaneously in events like this. They have prepared comments. He's in Michigan. He's addressing Arab discontent with Harris. Clearly, it was planned. This wasn't something that he just started to say on the fly and was floating thoughts around. I'm sure
I
he actually rehearsed that multiple times through
I
some
get the
group.
sense that a lot of the elders of the Democrat Party have a sort of what's the best way to say this? There's a
A
type of
maverick impulse.
arrogance staring down your because I'm
Yeah,
not just Bill Clinton, right? Like
yeah,
I know just a few weeks ago Obama went down and visited Black American voters and he started talking down to them about
yeah.
not being real men or not wanting to vote for a woman because they're men and they should not have these sorts of reservations. Then I'm thinking about Joe Biden going on a video recently and critiquing Trump's support, which again,
The
Kamala
Puerto
Harris like
Rican
backed
support.
away from that. But she after this, as you mentioned, the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe was his name. He joked that Puerto Rico was garbage, and then Biden gets on there and on a Skype call of all things and says, "I think Trump supporters are garbage," and then they try to walk that back by saying the supporters had an apostrophe S or something, and he meant actually just Tony Hinchcliffe and some people on his staff, and not all Trump supporters. And it was another disaster. But it seems like they have a problem where you have these elder former presidents or on the way to being former presidents who are just like saying things
I think with
and staring
Biden,
at all the voters.
I think with Biden, the gaffe excuse is more plausible simply because at his age, and when you hear him speak, there's very little coherence left. Often what he says is jumbled together. His age shows he just doesn't look good, frankly, even on a Zoom call. He doesn't look good. And he can barely get his thoughts across. And Biden is effectively no longer the president, and he hasn't been the president for quite some time.
Yeah.
But setting Biden aside, I think with Obama and Bill Clinton, I think there's probably a more deliberate approach that they take. I think there's probably, to your point, a little bit of ego around what they can absorb, even if they receive a little bit of scrutiny. I'm sure some of these things are weighed, like the pros and cons. So for him speaking to black men and saying, "Oh, yeah, be a real man to vote for a black woman. I'm sure that that comes from some place, right? Like, I don't think that he just thought that on his own. For some sort of polling or study was done within the NC, which showed that black men may not, more black men are going to support Trump than they have previously.
Yes, the
And seeing that,
percentages are way up now. I believe the last poll I saw was 6%, something like that. I think it's been rising over the years. I think from one election to the next, it just keeps
yeah,
going
the
up.
popular support for Trump amongst black men has grown. Black men are the larger constituent. Black women haven't shifted as much as black men have. And you see this even on the campaign trail, where increasingly you're seeing black men introducing Trump or speaking as part of campaign events. And with Barack Obama, he's probably trying to mitigate or address that impulse or that movement and trajectory. And perhaps this is one of the reasons they've attributed to is she's a woman, black men have a masculine impulse. Maybe that's the theory or the going theory, is my guess. Again, with Bill Clinton, I don't know.
He's about the same age as Biden.
He is, but he's
Yeah.
much more impaired. Biden's cognitive faculties and others are very much in decline.
I always felt like Clinton had a little more grasp of like, he could read the room, and he knew how to deal with
Yeah,
different groups and make them feel like,
no one
I'm gonna
booed
make
him.
you feel like the best."
Yeah, no one booed him when he
Yeah.
said those remarks.
He has
There's
a
certainly a lot of
gravitas
outrage in
about
the
him as
audience.
he's saying these things, but, when
Yeah.
you go back and look at it, you're like, "What the hell, man?"
Yeah, think about Biden made the garbage comment. Within, what, 2 hours? Harris had already disavowed that comment.
Yeah.
Within 2 hours, she had disavowed and distanced herself from the comment. Respectfully saying Biden himself and his team were in spin mode the exact same day to the New York Times running the apostrophe S excuse and rewriting of it, multiple media liberal media outlets, damage control was in override.
Yep.
Bill Clinton's comments were made outside of what? A couple of Twitter handles that maybe are popular and we're angry about it. Did we see any major media outlets run with that as a story, scandalizing that speech? Did we see Harris come over the top and distance herself from it?
No, not at all.
Any attention drawn to it? None.
Not at all.
It wasn't circulating on social media, such that her team clearly decided this isn't a major political liability for us, or certainly isn't something that we want to draw attention to and try to correct. So I think people need to just see what's going on. Look, and that's much the same way that Trump's team said, "Hey, we're not going to try to intervene and correct what Giuliani said." Right? They didn't say anything about Giuliani. Even if they differ with him, they didn't want to draw attention for whatever reason. They made a determination that said offending Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, it's fine. We can live with that.
Yeah.
The insult comment remark about Puerto Ricans, we want to reel that back a little bit.
So, one question I wanted to go back to, or really, I wanted to move into another area actually,
Sure.
and I wanted to just go off of your comments related to being truthful. So we had the imams. I'm forgetting the name of the imam now. Do you remember the name of the imam? I'm forgetting his name, but the imam in Dearborn, I believe it was,
Bilal
who
Zoheri.
yes, Bilal Zahedi came out and met with Trump with a number of other community leaders, and they laid out 5 or 6 different points of what is important to them. Among them was about family values and issues going on in schools, and there were a few other things related to immigration as well that he mentioned. He met with them. They did a press conference with him publicly. Trump publicly said, "I agree with everything you said." Fine. Then after that, he was called on to show he agreed to go on there, and I felt like the line of questioning that Mehdi Hassan engaged in was not really intellectually honest, in the sense that he would not ask the exact same questions if any Muslims came out and said, "We endorse Kamala Harris." So, for example, one of the things he kept saying was, "Trump is a liar. We know he's a liar. So, do you believe what he's saying, that he will be the peace candidate?" Like things like that. What do you
Oh,
think about asking these types of questions, or just the fact that he's let's start with that, just being a liar. Like,
yeah. So we can start on the lying comment.
yeah.
I don't know Bilal Zoheri, the imam. I didn't watch the interview. But on the question of lying, I don't know of a major political candidate that doesn't lie or
That's my thought as well.
that hasn't lied ubiquitously as part of their careers.
Right.
Um, Joe Biden, his first presidential run was in '88, and he was effectively disqualified from it because of how frequently he was lying.
Did
He lied about his academic background. He said he had 3 degrees, he had 1. He said he graduated at the top of his class, he graduated at the very bottom of his class. He ripped entire speeches from other politicians, including some from the UK at the time, charting out.
I thought that was one of the driving reasons that he was actually plagiarizing, and
Yeah,
he was caught plagiarizing.
he was plagiarizing, he was lying. He's repeatedly done so throughout his career. He said that he was arrested trying to go and free Nelson Mandela, and he has said that story multiple times. Never happened.
Uh,
He's a habitual liar, lies all the time. The man does not have an honest bone in his body. And so when we're talking about dishonesty with politicians, the question really isn't, does candidate lie? Are they capable of lying? All presidential candidates are capable of lying. The question is, relative to other presidential candidates, given the context right now, do you believe that they will carry out at least some of what they've agreed to? And what's your reasoning behind endorsing or backing their candidacy on the basis of an agreement that may eventually be reneged upon? Now, I don't know Bella Zohedi, and I'm not defending Trump because I wouldn't vote for Trump, right? I don't intend to. But just steel manning the position as a exercise in political thinking, I think a person could easily say that Trump's team has repeatedly reached out and courted our vote. Harris's team has not. Trump's team has negotiated these terms. It's not as if they conceded them immediately. Trump additionally agreed to them in public.
yeah, he's not afraid to be seen with Muslims in public. I
Mhm.
definitely would not vote for him or endorse him. But it says something that after all the time that Muslims have been saying, "Look, you support us, you believe in us. Why don't you put us on stage with you at some point?" Or even, I think one probably one of the most ironic things for me with this whole thing is the biggest criticism from people like Mehdi Hassan is, "Oh, don't you remember the Muslim ban?" And then you look at it and you're like, "Wait a second, right now, if I go look, it's actually the Harris campaign that's banning Muslims from their rallies." Like if you're gonna talk about quote unquote Islamophobia and
Well,
Muslim bias, they're doing that.
before we even get to the Muslim ban, just sticking on this, you say, okay, he agreed to these things. 2 days after the meeting, there's a report in the Times of Israel that Trump contacted Netanyahu and told him to end the war by the time he enters office. If that's even remotely true, which the Times of Israel is not a left wing outlet, it's not some pro Palestinian advocacy org.
Mm,
It's a media outlet in Israel that has aligned to the Netanyahu administration. So, if that's even remotely true, it would represent a greater amount of pressure being placed on Netanyahu to stop the fighting than Harris and Biden have managed to apply in over a year. Just that single phone call would be more than the collective of what we know Biden, Harris, Blinken, all of them have done in over a year, which is insane to think about.
well,
Absolutely insane to think about. And a
I'm
huge indictment
yeah.
of their administration.
The one concern I would have with this is that throughout, I would say, the past year,
Yeah.
we know that the Biden-Harris administration and through Anthony Blinken as well, they've been quote unquote leaking that they have voiced their frustrations and their anger with going and telling them you got to wrap up the war, you have to do better, and then they come back and say we're not going to do that, and they keep quote unquote leaking this information out so that we know that they're trying. In the meantime, I'm also concerned that this is like something very similar, where we know that the Netanyahu administration is actually in favor of the Trump administration coming into power. And as a favor of this will help me with this community, say this, and then we'll roll that back later.
So,
That would be my biggest
yeah,
concern because it seems like that's what
it's
everyone
quite
does
it's
with
quite
Israel.
possible. Although I think the most concrete leaks that have come out of the Biden White House have been far more oblique. Him telling Netanyahu to F off or using some sort of profanity. I don't believe there's been a single credible report about them saying this has to end.
That's
It
true.
has to end.
I haven't heard
I,
anything
I
like
don't
that
think
myself.
I don't think they've ever said that once or
Just do
put
a
a
better
time.
job of not bombing everyone.
Yeah, don't use 2,000 pound bombs, please. Allow more aid
After
in.
we hand it to you, don't use it.
They have to allow more aid in, things like that.
Yeah.
It's also the case that a lot of the people in the Biden administration, I think, what's the guy's name? Amos Hochstein and others, just inveterate Zionist voices and figures who are essentially orchestrating Biden administration's Israel policies. I believe he's a former IDF member.
Mhm.
And people like that are the ones that are driving the ship a little bit here. But nevertheless, I think if you were to look at that, Blinken, now you have credible leaks and reports about the degree to which he has been willing to lie and manipulate the political process to support Israel. So I don't think there's any weight a person can place in anything that Blinken has said or Biden has said when those selective leaks have come out showing some degree of dissatisfaction, which is about as much as we've gotten. Now, in saying that, I fully concede that Trump not I think there are plenty of reasons not to believe him. Got
Yeah.
$100 million from Miriam Adelson. We've heard Jared Kushner talk about things like beachfront property and turning Gaza into that.
Still needs to finish the job. Yeah,
So
all that.
I don't think, and at the end of the day, it's not as if Trump is some sort of a dove. Nevertheless, there are reasons to think that Trump has, and this is just as a descriptive matter. Jeremy Scahill has spoken about this, who's not a liberal at all. Others have done the same thing, which is that recent political history, we have not had a president in America who has not started a new war outside of Trump. Trump has been the single candidate that hasn't. We also do have a track record with Trump at times of trying to end wars. So we do have him making an attempt to pull out of Syria. He was famously subverted on that by different military leaders, which was cheered on by American liberals and Democrats who thought that those people were doing heroic moves by not listening to Trump.
Mhm.
We also have Trump negotiating. His administration negotiated peace with the Taliban and started the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. We have Trump's refusal to take military action against Iran, although obviously he did
Yeah,
ramp up
killed lots of
drones.
money
Yeah,
though.
Qasem Soleimani ramped up drones in his first 2 years. Again, so it's a mixed bag, but I
Mixed
think
bag.
when it comes descriptively to the pro-war sentiment that we've seen from the other side, one of the core things that Trump has campaigned on, above and beyond the Muslim community, has been that he is not a warmonger. He talks about endless wars and criticizes them, and he does so in front of all of his constituencies, not just with Muslims.
I thought JD Vance's interview with Jake Tapper recently was also very enlightening in that every time Tapper was trying to trap him and say, "Look at all these military generals, look at his chief of staff, look at everyone who has said that he's not fit and capable." I think JD Vance's retort was Trump is pro peace and wants to stop the endless wars. All these people, whether it's Master or anyone else, they were all either fired or they were forced out because they wanted to go to war. And Trump was the one who said, no, let's not go to war.
So I think given all those facts, a person like Bilal Zuhairi, if I was steel manning his position, I'd say it's entirely possible
That he's
that
lying.
Trump will renege and not follow through. But I think relative to the Harris campaign and what's already been done, what is certain with the Harris campaign, given that we have a imminent and immediate track record here, and given what the Trump campaign has both said to us, said broadly, and extended to us by way of courting us, meeting with us, and agreeing to things that we've said publicly, we're at least hedging our bets in a way just based on probabilities. We're making a decision that we believe is probabilistically advancing our interests in a better direction than the alternative.
For
And
this,
so we're weighing potential outcomes and we're saying that this one provides us a better likelihood of certain outcomes than the alternative. And I think that's a very difficult argument to counteract, to be very, very candid about it. I
yeah,
think when people think about the lesser of two evils, to me, just taking a step back, I really do think that there's a genuine argument for Trump being the lesser of two evils if you're reducing politics to a lesser of two evils calculation and saying that I just have to support the one that is the lesser of two evils. And if that's the only thing that motivates how you're going to vote in a given election, I think there's a very strong case to be made for Trump this time around.
yeah. And I don't know how anyone can make a lesser of two evils argument in favor of the Biden Harris, or in this case, just Harris, because very simply, very frankly, they have armed genocide and they have done so without any sort of reservation. Whether you look at their state spokespeople showing up and giving reports, there's never a time where they say, yeah, we're really concerned about what Israel is doing. Let's put an end to what they're doing, or let's halt the weapon. There's just nothing. They're always making excuses and saying Israel needs to investigate itself. And you can see the genuine frustration from the whole press corps that are sitting there and asking these questions. They're just so frustrated because they're like, you just keep saying there's going to be an investigation, you keep deferring, you won't take action, and then when you say you've actually conducted an investigation of Israel's actions, you're saying it's completely within the law. There are no crimes that have been committed. And so we're going to keep giving them weapons. And it's, what are you smoking, bro? This is
Yeah,
ridiculous. And then on the question of like lies, just to add to what you were saying as far as steel manning that position, it's a constant criticism of Harris herself. She would have probably failed the 2004 election on just the issue of flip flopping on the issues that she used to hold near and dear in 2019, 2020, that were very far more progressive left. And now, as she's come into this election, she's just completely gone, I guess you could say, centrist, and is, whether it's fracking or anything else. And like anybody asking, like, well, why would you trust Trump? I'm like, just in principle, on all other issues, why would you trust Harris either? It doesn't make sense to ask, like, why would you trust a politician? By default, the dealing with a politician is you don't trust them, and you
yeah,
try really hard to see if you're going to get that one or the two issues that you really think they might follow through on, and you try to get a sense of that. That's really it. I don't understand this line of
absolutely.
question
And
about
so,
they're liars.
yeah, I think this sort of high-minded moralizing
Yeah.
and taking this sort of maximalist, sanctimonious position against Trump is very hypocritical. I always find it to be very hypocritical because it treats Trump as an exceptional figure, as if
Right.
he's unique. He cuts some unique arc in the American political landscape. And this is something Noam Chomsky used to talk about, even though he was always Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you follow Chomsky. Chomsky every 4 years, he's very anti-American empire. He's always railing against a lot of the same issues we're concerned with, especially war, American imperialism. Every 4 years, he nevertheless comes out and says, we have to do the lesser of two evils, and that's the Democratic candidate.
Hmm.
And so he's just about, I think he's endorsed the Democratic candidate for president my entire life that I've been following him. And against Trump, both in the race against Hillary Clinton and when Trump was running against Biden, both times he did that. Nevertheless, one of the things he has highlighted and drawn attention to is that he says that many of the things that people object to the most about Donald Trump are actually the best parts of his policy platform, right? So he refers often to Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And he says that's actually a very sensible approach, trying to bring it to an end, trying to diffuse tensions, build bilateral relations with Russia, not treat them like a pariah state. He says that that makes sense for the international order instead of this insane sort of war of attrition where there's ongoing and ratcheted up conflict across the globe. He says, or that that's in fact one of the best parts of Trump's entire platform. And yet that seems to be the source of so much consternation. Brings up Trump's opposition to the US intelligence community and his stated opposition to the way in which they operate and function, have overreach. So that's one of the best parts of his platform. Again. So he'll highlight these things, and he says the things that actually makes the establishment media so angry about Trump are actually the things that he seems to appreciate the most about Trump, and the things that he sort of the grounds upon which he opposes Trump are actually the things that the mainstream media and even the politicians he's voting for don't seem to care a whole lot about.
Mhm.
So the climate and things like that, he'd bring those things up as really important issues to him, but they're clearly not major issues to the candidates that he's voting for, let alone to the media that's actually covering these races.
So let's talk a bit about Jill Stein. So she's tied with Harris, as we mentioned earlier, in a poll conducted by CARE. And that is a bit surprising given her limited chances of winning. Usually, when we think of people going for candidates, they go for one or the other, with the third party candidate getting a very small share. Some people are principled and think, "Well, maybe we should hope and dream one day for a third party." This year, though, because of what's happening in Gaza, Jill Stein, of course, her position has been very say, pro Palestinian and anti Zionism. But do you think that voting for Stein could influence the Democratic Party in the future? I know that there are some people saying that no, it's not going to happen. There was that monologue with Mehdi Hassan where he said, just because we vote for Stein, it's going to be just like Bernie, and Bernie had no impact on the Democratic Party. Do you think that even if we don't win with Stein, which we're definitely not going to win, there's a potential that it could shift the Democratic Party, and maybe give us some historical grounding here?
Yeah, I mean, the discussion on Bernie was probably one of the dumbest points he made. If the impact of abandoned Harris and Stein running comes close to resembling the effect and impact that Bernie Sanders had, it will be a resounding success by any measure. Just an incredible success. if they can pull that off. Bernie Sanders fundamentally shaped and changed the entire complexion of the Democratic Party. And so many people have written about this. The power that he exerts in the party today is shared by very few politicians within the Democratic Party. So, this idea that Bernie Sanders is an outcast from the party and has been marginalized because he ran against Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden is at radical odds with the facts.
I think because
And
he ran with Hillary, he became a hero. And actually, if it weren't for Elizabeth Warren, he probably would have won and beaten Biden. There's a good
absolutely,
chance at least.
I think against Biden, it's very tough to be a retread and to capture the same sort of moment and motivation and energy and momentum that you had the first time around. I felt the same thing with Ron Paul, especially when you're this contrarian candidate.
Yeah.
You have a lot more momentum the first time around, the second time around, it's a bit more tired, it's very difficult to come out with novel issues. Bernie himself, I thought the second campaign, he showed his age a little bit more.
Yeah,
I
he had
didn't
the heart attack as well, but I think he got a huge bump after he came back after the heart attack, went through the I think I'm not sure if he had a surgery, he just had to go to the hospital, but then he came back on the debate stage, and then he received a bump again in the polls as a
Yeah,
result.
I don't think he's a terribly charismatic speaker. I think he had long odds to begin with because I just think that the Bernie movement and wave, it's very fickle, right? It always was, and so I expected it to come down to earth. People win leading in the beginning, don't always win at the end. And Bernie's campaign, I thought, could have done with better organizing, planning, and strategizing overall. So that's like a separate issue.
Mhm.
On Stein, yeah, I think Stein can absolutely influence the Democratic Party if they're smart. If she actually gains some momentum, rather than allowing their sort of left wing of the political platform to be cannibalized by Stein's movement, they would try to assimilate her group into the party and try to concede some of her core issues that are more easily delivered upon, and then negotiate maybe her into some wing of the party or some people that can actually relate to her into a wing of the party. I don't think that's going to be done right now. Their approach today has been to basically take the gloves off and attack her and use people like AOC and Bernie Sanders as attack dogs against the Green Party. But that's also suggestive of the fact that they have to take them a lot more seriously. Right?
Mhm.
I don't think in past elections they've acknowledged the existence of the Green Party. This time around, not only have they acknowledged the existence of it, but they're putting out some of their key surrogates and most influential speakers to actually address the Green Party and continue to criticize them, which AOC has repeatedly done now for weeks.
Yeah,
And
they're also
so,
and I think they're also putting out ads as well. Actually, it's interesting. They're putting out ads against the Greens and
yeah, there's one reporter, I was reading something from him earlier today, where he received a text message from the Harris campaign. He lives in Pennsylvania. And the text read, and I'm paraphrasing, "Are you upset about Gaza? Question mark. If you are, let's vote Harris together. And when you vote Harris in Pennsylvania, we'll connect you with two voters in a comfortable blue state to vote Stein.
wow.
So you'll get two Stein votes for your Harris vote, but those two Stein votes will just come in a comfortably Democratic state so that the Electoral College vote isn't disrupted. But in your state of Pennsylvania, you go to Harris, and with Harris, we can win together to defeat Trump."
I wonder what the election laws and rules are around that kind of horse trading. It
Yeah.
seems very shady.
Yeah, it probably wasn't Harris's camp herself. I'm sure it was like political action committee, some activist group that's doing it. So, there's always plausible deniability, right? I doubt it was orchestrated by her group itself. But yeah, it's all a big joke, right? But nevertheless, all of these things just go to show that they're taking Stein really seriously and worried about the impact that she's going to have in a razor thin election that's supposed to be really close. And I think going forward, the best outcome for Stein and certainly for the abandoned movement is a Harris loss. That is the absolute best outcome. And I think a potentially difficult, demoralizing outcome would be a Harris victory.
So now what do you think will happen with the Abandon Harris movement and also the Muslim community in general, right? Because we're very fractured. Obviously,
Yeah.
many of us are like if taken together between the support for Stein and then the support for Trump, you're looking at about 52% polling versus 42% against Harris. What does that do for our community internally? And then what will that do you again? It's hard to say anything with how flaky people are with keeping their promises. But what does it say for our community? What does it say for the people of Gaza as well if Harris does win, despite all these protestations from our community?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I think number one, we should always be skeptical of some of the internal polling. We don't know the sample populations. We don't know how well represented they are. No sample poll in the last election told us that Trump was going to win over 20% of the Muslim vote, and he did. He won, what, 22% of the Muslim vote last election? It's
Yeah,
with
and I
COVID,
believe in Michigan by default he had 30% as well,
something like that.
without any of these issues that we're talking about now.
So I think if you look at most pre election polls, they drastically undercount or don't fully represent Trump's support base. And there are different reasons they've attributed to that. One is obviously the scope and scale of who these sample polls tend to actually poll. Like your sample populations draw from a very specific socioeconomic strata as opposed to others. So that's one issue. The other issue is what they call Trump voter, either shame, insecurity, some combination of the two. The idea that people who support Trump don't necessarily always want people to know that they're supporting Trump.
It's true. That happened last time, I think in 2016, and again, I think maybe even in 2020 as well.
They talk about that a lot because people are scared of being judged. They're scared of being criticized. They understand just how polarizing politics are today. They'd rather not get into a fight. But when they show up in the polls, they check the box for Trump. And so, again, I would be a bit skeptical of those polls only because I don't know how well they reflect the genuine sentiment. And we'll only find out after a couple of days where people's votes actually end up being tallied. My feeling is going forward, irrespective of what the political outcome is for this election, is that our community is really politically fractured. I think we are going to have to come to terms with the fact that we aren't a single party, single candidate constituency. There are some minority groups in this country that vote as a block 80, 90%, 95% for a single candidate. That may not be our future. We may be much more diverse than that, especially given the fact that Muslims are more ethnically diverse than any other minority community. Most minority communities are ethnically monolithic. That's not the case for us. We're more socioeconomically diverse. And so there are a lot of things that come to bear on the way we view elections that can diverge within the community itself. We may have different intra Muslim constituencies that think differently about politics, or may have different priorities based on how they're thinking about politics. And to give you an example of this, we think about foreign policy. One of the constituencies that's come out in favor, at least some of them have come out in favor of Trump, has been Pakistani groups. Some Pakistani groups have come out in favor of Trump. Now, again, some people are outraged about that, et cetera, et cetera. And whatever you think, we have, and Ryan Grimm, Dropsite, others have reported a lot on this. When the vote of no confidence was made for Imran Khan, and he was thrown in prison shortly thereafter, after being president of Pakistan, came on the heels of him basically speaking out against pressure being applied from the United States for him to back Ukraine against Russia.
Mm.
Said, not our conflict, not going to do it. Imran Khan was a populist candidate, wanted to create some independence from the West. You have leaked emails from people within the CIA, the Biden White House, that gave the green light to remove Imran Khan. You have over the past year, on multiple occasions, questions that have been raised about the integrity, the democratic process in Pakistan that have taken place in the State Department that have all been summarily dismissed, responded. The half-hearted efforts that you see in responding to questions about Gaza, you get even less.
Mm.
Pakistan shows up. No effort even being made. It has been months now that Imran Khan has been in prison. His condition is deteriorating. There is a possibility that within the next few months, if things don't improve, or if he is not released, that he could die in prison. So, yeah, again, you have to think about it. People just see, okay, this Pakistani Political Action Committee backed Trump, and they care about Imran Khan. Mehdi has to look at that. These people are being taken for a ride, et cetera, et cetera. But that's likely because he hasn't followed the gravity of what's taken place over the past year. And Imran Khan, arguably the most important political prisoner in the world right now, given how long he's been there. The Biden administration's immediately incriminated into the political circumstances and conditions of Pakistan. And so I'm just trying to show that there are multiple reasons why people might back one candidate or another. And those are all things of consequence, really important consequence, not just, oh, are they going to reduce my tax burden because I want to keep more of my money or something like that.
I think there are people like that within our community as well. I've known of a few, but I also think that there is a skepticism sometimes
Mm,
of the exaggerated rhetoric around racism. I remember speaking with one family member years ago and asking her, "Who are you gonna vote for?" And she said, "Trump." I said, "But he doesn't like Muslims." Like the famous quote,
yeah,
"Islam hates us." So I said, "Why are you gonna vote for him?" And this is in the 2020 election.
yeah.
She said, "Look, Democrats have been saying for years that this candidate is the most racist candidate, and this election is the most important election for the well-being and the safety and the whatever for our community. So we have to vote Democrat to protect ourselves from these racists." But then that never really happens. What actually happened was when Trump was president, he set into place rules that blocked a lot of international foreign workers from coming in, which meant that now they had to hire domestic workers. She said one of them was my husband, and he had more job opportunities as a result of that. Had that not been the case, he would not have had that. So I think there's a lot of discussion around, oh, if you voted for Trump, then either you are a racist or you don't care that he's a racist. And I think people sometimes have a way of separating out for any candidate the negative things that they really don't like. Like, for example, we vote for Democrats, but we completely neglect things like LGBTQ or abortion, which are huge issues in our that we should be considering as we vote for Democrats, and we hold our noses and just vote, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think there are a lot of, I would say, I don't want to say pro-Trump, but I would say people who will vote for Trump, and they will hold their noses and vote for Trump because it's not so much lesser of two evils, but there is some sort of interest single issue that they have that they think is important for their own needs.
There's no vote that you can plausibly make for a candidate, be it Oliver Chase Oliver, is that his name? The
Oliver
libertarian
Chase, yeah, the
candidate.
libertarian candidate,
Oliver
yeah.
Oliver Chase, yeah, Oliver Chase, Jill Stein, Trump, Harris, all of them come with major concessions. And they have policies and positions within their platforms that I think a person is going to have to question and range from problematic to obscene to immoral. I think a person has to weigh the relative goods that they hope to get out of a candidate, the harms that they hope to avert with the particular candidate winning, and they have to be brutally honest with themselves about what, in fact, they see coming about. The end result of that type of deliberation may be, I really don't know, so I'm not going to vote for a candidate. Frankly, I might just not vote for one. I actually consider that a very defensible position for people to take. I don't look down at people who say, you know what, I just decided not to vote for someone in the presidential election, given all of these, it's just very complicated and I don't know. And I had to think it long and hard and whatever. The people that I judge more critically are people who I think are just really blase and passe about the type of compromises they have to make and just pretend that they don't exist. Especially, and I understand the type of sentiment when people say we can't be single issue voters.
Yeah.
But when the single issue is genocide, that is precisely the context in which you would be a single issue voter. I would say normally that's entirely a justifiable way to look at politics. When you're looking at a genocide, being a single issue voter is in fact not only reasonable, it should be expected.
Now, a genocide has taken place. The
Yep.
Democrats are definitely arming and supporting it, and I would argue that people such as our friend who we've mentioned a few times, Mehdi Hasan, is not really doing enough to say that Biden and Harris are war criminals. But let's put that aside. Let's assume that Trump actually comes into power, and indeed he has lied. Further intensifies his support for Netanyahu, and more death and destruction follow. What would your response then afterwards be if these people come back and say, "See, we told you this was going to happen. You didn't listen to us, and now look what we have. It's worse over there, and it's worse over here for us too."
I think they're going to say that no matter what.
But let's assume, for
But
the sake of
but
this
but
discussion, that it
yeah.
actually.
But I think for the sake of the discussion, if it's true, I think if it does happen, my own sense, and again, this is the potential that you think about. You think about potential possibilities, outcomes. You'd say organizing an anti-war and anti-genocide movement against Trump is more likely to have success than one against Harris. Because with Harris, she's openly running against the genocide charge. And her victory against the genocide charge would mean that genocide is not a political liability and is not something that she has to politically defend herself against going forward. For Trump to win an election, having pandered in some degree to anti-genocide protest, and then to violate that after he gets into office, there would be more credible grounds to oppose that. And I think people are just more naturally reviled and repulsed by Trump as a human being. Aaron Mate always says that a lot of the establishment hates Trump because he puts an ugly face on empire. He just puts an ugly face on the American empire.
It's an interesting take.
Yeah, that's what he says. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So if I'm being just really honest about things, if Trump ha- had been president last October, there's no question in my mind that the protesting, public opposition, and political opposition at all levels would have been far greater against Trump than what we've seen against Biden and Harris. I think we would have seen many Americans who are not intimately connected to Palestine or the Muslim community come together in solidarity with Muslims and Palestinians and other groups like Jewish Voices for Peace. The type of coalition that we have currently would be so much larger right now.
Yeah, I get the sense that if what I mentioned as our hypothetical comes to fruition, you would find that the centrists have all of a sudden, for their own interests, come together with progressives, will come together with these other organizations and would vehemently oppose Trump and everything that he's doing. And they would find a way to say, we did this, but he's 10 times worse. And now we have to oppose him even harder. And he said he was not going to do this. We have to really oppose him now.
Yeah, in fact, there were articles about how MBS and others were attempting to accomplish normalization prior to October 7th. And they felt it would have been easier for them to have moved forward with normalization agreements under a Democratic administration. And this was something that was reported that they felt that it was going to be an easier thing for them to do domestically in their own countries to do so with the Democrat than to do so with the Republican.
That's
And,
interesting. Why did they feel that? It seemed like Trump was on board. Remember the picture with all of them with their hands on the big glowing globe?
oh yeah,
Why would they find it easier with Democrats versus a Republican or with Trump?
yeah. I imagine that domestically constituencies that oppose Trump or see him as anti-Arab or anti-Muslim don't hold the same opinion of President Biden. Right? Biden and Harris are seen as more ecumenical. They are willing to work across the aisle. They're seen as reasonable and deliberate political actors. A lot of politics is a game of perception, right? Barack Obama came into the office in his first week in office. He won the Nobel Peace
Nobel
Prize.
Peace Prize.
Yeah, first week in office, right? He hadn't done anything. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. People look back with a lot of nostalgia to Barack Obama's presidency in 2 terms without looking to a lot of the substance of some of the worst policies that he enacted and carried out as part of his administration. But a lot of that is just built on perception. Perception can be more powerful than reality. Joe Biden, one of the things that helped him in his campaign was the perception of him being a comfortable grandfather, elderly man. Many people continue to refer to Joe Biden as a person of integrity. He's a
Which is
family man.
the exact opposite of what he is.
Even as a family man, they talk about how much Joe Biden loves his family and his children, his grandchildren. And first of all, that's an incredibly low bar. And like who like hates their children?
I think even I remember when Hillary Clinton was debating Trump, they asked her, "Say, tell us one good thing about Trump." And even for Trump, she was like, "He's really good with his kids. He's raised really good kids." It's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Even Trump can
But
hit that bar.
yeah, like loving your children is like a very low bar, number one.
Yeah.
Even if a person's who's followed Joe Biden's career on these things, he's just so horrible,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So Hunter Biden, for instance, fathered a child, I believe, out of wedlock. He was fighting a child custody case in courts in Arkansas, where he fathered this child. And he was fighting it because he wanted to reduce his paternity payments or child support payments. And so he told Joe Biden not to acknowledge that he actually had that granddaughter.
Wow.
And for 4 years, Joe Biden deliberately did not acknowledge the existence of that grandchild. So he has 7 grandchildren. Every single time he would refer to his 6 grandchildren. He wrote a children's book. In the beginning, he dedicated the book to his grandchildren, wrote out the names of all 6. For 4 years, he did this. Now, someone
Wow.
can say, oh, it's a messy situation for his son and it's an internal family issue. But even if you apply that standard, for a grandfather to not acknowledge his grandchild for 4 years, what type of human being is that?
Politician.
Like, yeah, exactly. This whole
It
thing
goes
about,
back
oh,
to our original, why
you
are you
essentially
holding
think,
Trump to this standard or
yeah,
defend him? What's
yeah,
the deal?
this is what I find nuts about, it's not that, okay, Trump has done all these horrible things.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. Sexual assault that he brings up and
Yeah,
Trump
yeah.
boasted. Absolutely, that, like,
Yeah, yeah.
these are grounds upon which I could not back Trump. I don't consider these trivial things.
Of
But
course.
who's Tara Reid? As if she has brought up no allegations against Joe Biden of sexual assaulting and raping her.
Right.
They're real things that have happened. In Joe Biden's career, lying. Joe Biden said that he was like the driving force behind the Voting Rights Act and pushing Strom Thurmond to support the Voting Rights Act and to promote desegregation. The exact opposite's the case. Joe Biden crusaded against busing to help desegregate schools.
Oh, yeah, Kamala Harris brought that up in the debate. That was the moment that elevated her in the 2019 debates, in
Yeah,
the primaries against
we're
Joe
talking about the
Biden.
70s and 80s. He was pushing policies to maintain various forms of racial segregation. The guy's rewrites his life story all the time. And this does not even begin to account for the actual policies that he's backed in his political career and the material harm that continues to get advanced under this current administration and that Harris has been a key piece of. So yeah, again, I don't mean to, I hope people don't get the impression that somehow I'm saying all of this to promote Trump. I think we've made the disclaimer multiple
Or
times.
even Stein for that matter.
And yeah, absolutely. I think the point here has been to merely say that the type of exceptionalizing of Trump in the popular media and then by certain Muslim Democratic voices is totally unfounded. And although I'm personally not in favor of people, it would take very crazy circumstances. It would take a lot for me to say that an imam or a Muslim religious figure should back any politician explicitly, right? It's one thing for someone who's already sort of part of political advocacy circles to do. I think for a Muslim religious figure, especially one of repute, the bar is very high for that to become a justifiable activity.
What
Yeah,
would you say, we talk about people, like, advocating for who they want, Kamala Harris,
yeah.
Trump, Stein, whatever. There's a discussion that perhaps advocating for one candidate over another might be considered theologically, religiously, blameworthy. In what circumstance is it considered blameworthy, and what circumstance would it not be considered blameworthy, no matter who you chose?
I don't know. I don't think there's Allah knows best. Perhaps there would be an election in which the theological lines would be very obvious.
Given the
But
circumstances that we know.
yeah, yeah, I'm just saying, I'm just taking it back conceptually. I'm saying that perhaps there would be an election where it would be. I think in most elections that we'll witness, especially in a society, and given that we're in a non-Muslim society in the context of the elections, it's not going to be so stark, such that it's wajib to vote for this candidate and Muslims have to come out for them because there's some clear a purpose and the alternative is X, Y, or Z. I don't think it's quite so stark. I think the question that I always pose is I can say that I have a very strong political preference for a candidate. My preference is not Harris. I've been explicit about that. I've written about that.
Yeah.
And same way I wrote about Biden. The question that I've posed plenty of times is not so much who people vote for, but why they vote for them. Prophet said, "Innamal a'malu binniyat." All deeds are judged according to their intention. If a person votes for a political candidate that has overseen a genocide, they have to ask themselves how they're reconciling that with their political decisions. If they do so by trivializing the genocide, ignoring it, or treating it like it's nothing, that is a morally blameworthy decision. If they have some other calculus that I might look at as naive or foolish or misinformed or that I just disagree with, at the end of the day, inshallah, they're making some sort of personal ijtihad. They're doing their best. They're deliberating as best they can. And they're saying, look, I think at the end of the day, even if she's been horrible, even if she's overseen a genocide and is in favor of it, the alternative is Trump. I think Trump's going to be worse on these counts. And one of those two is going to win. Again, I disagree with that. I think there's a way to deconstruct that argument. Nevertheless, if someone were just to make it in those very plain, superficial terms, I'd say, okay, people can disagree on that. I don't see that as something that's theologically otherizing. I wouldn't ostracize someone theologically on that basis. But again,
You
I
judge
think
them harshly, you call them naive, but
yeah, I might criticize them.
I'm just kidding.
I'd say I might criticize them on some other grounds. I wouldn't say that they're a bad Muslim for doing that,
Of course.
right? I wouldn't say they were a bad Muslim for doing that,
Maybe it's a bad
right?
decision, we don't like the decision,
"Oh,
but
I don't
yeah,
like the decision, whatever." I'd say, "Oh, maybe you're not good," but I actually don't get too bent out of shape over something like that, to be honest. I don't. If someone's and I think the same thing for any candidate, right? If what sort of inspires me to vote for a candidate is some theory that I've attached myself to in an irrational way, such that I no longer care about really critical moral issues that attend to that person's platform, I do consider that blameworthy for a person to have developed that type of sensibility about society. Because politics for us today, we're engaged in how we want the public square to look and how we can navigate our differences and how we can affect positive change here and around the globe, given the unique capacity of America as the global hegemon. And so I think we have to be invested in trying to improve our society. And obviously, politics much bigger than just the act of voting. You have to be invested in this work of society. You have to be invested in cultural contributions that we can make. There's a lot of work that we have ahead of us. I also think at times we can embellish the importance of the specific November 5th election, right? And the act of just showing up to the polls every 2 years on a Tuesday. There's a lot more that goes into affecting change on the ground above and beyond just those sort of political. But again, I think going back to your question, what's theologically consequential? I think what people's motivations, intentions are, and how they think about issues that are significant in the sight of God. Those are the things that will carry them forward beyond one election. Because if a person's right in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their heart's in a good place with how they think about issues and how they think about issues that have moral consequence, then obviously that there's going to be a lot of things that align or fall into place where a person doesn't have to compartmentalize a lot of their convictions or somehow treat them as if they're insignificant, where once they do that over time, they get accustomed to treating things that are good as evil and evil as good. You invert your moral sensibilities. You become a person who's advocating for evil, which is one of the characteristics of the munafiqeen, Allah tells us. They command the evil, they forbid that which is good. We don't want people to go down these types of paths.
of course.
And so when we're trying to tell them about how to orient themselves to politics, I think the most fundamental thing that people have to think about is not losing their way. Because there's only a short, and if people are going to allow themselves to go completely astray at the altar of politics, their heart is going to be sullied, their spiritual state is going to be weakened. They're going to have to answer to God for all of that. And
And not just for themselves, I think it's also important to point out that they're taking other people down that path because it's a public action that they're doing, right? In
yeah,
supporting, they're also potentially misleading other people down that path as well. And potentially even for the same reasons that they've taken if they advocate along those lines.
that's politicians can lie. We shouldn't lie. I shouldn't lie about his track record. I shouldn't lie about the things that he has said. I shouldn't lie about the times that he's been deceitful or deceptive. There should be a genuine level of integrity and honesty that stands behind whatever support that I'm granting him. And likewise for Jill Stein and others. If I'm an advocate for a third party vote, I should be forthright with people about the fact that there are a lot of parts of our plank platform that are unsatisfactory.
Think back to what we began this conversation with about the Muslims for Harris group, in which one participant unfortunately wrote that this is not really a genocide and shouldn't have been called such. That type of thought process, I think we can certainly say that person is mistaken at the very least and find a way to correct that so that we don't see that become widespread. I feel like this might be an example of that blameworthy sort of support
Yeah.
versus, yeah, we think Harris is the better option. She supported Eid al-Adha. She'll be better for Muslims overall. She will eventually deal with this situation with Gaza in the right way once she's in office.
Yeah, the Eid al-Adha thing, I think I'm not too angry about. Like you said, that's a token, trivial
Token,
thing.
it's
Maybe
just
he
so
did. I can definitely live with that more than I can live with the diminishing of genocide.
yeah, absolutely.
If someone were to say, "Hey, she did this Eid al-Adha reception and Muslims were invited, and so she's not really alienating Muslims as much as you think, and she really does care about Muslims or whatever," yeah, I might roll my eyes at something like that. But I think someone making that argument, okay, whatever. Maybe some people buy it, maybe they won't. I wouldn't fight someone over that. Although I wouldn't be persuaded by it personally, and I don't think it's terribly persuasive. But I think when someone starts saying the genocide's really not a genocide or it's not that big a deal or You have to think about all these other issues like abortion and LGBT rights, and it's okay, what's going on, right? That's when people start saying those things, I'm like, what type of person are you becoming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jazakumullah khair, Ustadh
Yeah,
Mubeen, for this enlightening discussion. As we close today, we want to remind everyone to make thoughtful and choices with good intentions this election season. And let's also remember our brothers and sisters in Gaza in our du'as and praying for peace, justice, and resilience in these challenging times. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect the people of Gaza, to bring peace to our brothers and sisters there
yeah.
and around the world who are suffering, grant them strength and patience and relief from oppression. I mean, thank you all again for listening. And please remember to vote if you want to and make your voice heard. We'll be back soon, inshallah, with more updates. Stay safe, stay strong. And inshallah, we will continue to push for positive change. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.